Hey, welcome to another video. In this video, we're going to be talking about files. Now, files are really important because they allow us to be able to save data, settings, properties, or whatever from one execution of the program to the next. You can also store them in databases, but files are usually a little bit easier to work with. And so since this is more of a beginner's class, that's generally what we will look at is using files. Now, there's a lot of programs that do use files for like configuration to be able to keep track of certain things that, let's say, should be displayed to the screen or other settings that you may be interested in. So if you've ever messed with like the Windows operating system or any operating system or some fancier programs, sometimes they'll have settings files that you can go in and can change values of variables. And whenever the program or operating system starts up or runs, whatever, it'll read that file and then will, can change the way that the application works. So let's look at files. Generally, what we do is we start off with sequential access, which means we start at the beginning of the file and we read through into the end. You can think of a file as just a stream of characters or a character stream. Really what that means is you look at one character at a time from beginning to the end of the file. Sometimes you'll read one line at a time. So you'll read the first line of text, then read the second line of text, and so on. So let's look at some of the different commands that we'll use in Visual Basic. First thing we have to do is declare a variable that will be our file variable. What we call this in Visual Basic, we call it a stream writer class that allows us to be able to write to a file. And so we need a variable that we refer to whenever we want to do things to a file. Like, for example, if we want to open the file, we want to read from the file, write to the file, or close the file. Those are the four main operations that you do on a file. So let's first look at opening the file or actually declaring the our variable. And here's a couple examples. We have dim output file as IO writer, as IO stream writer, and here's one that's a private variable out file as IO dot stream writer. To be able to create text, in other words, what it's doing is you're creating a brand new file. You use this syntax io.file.create text and you give it a file name, which will be a string. Or if you want to append or add to the end of a file that already exists, you could use io.file.append text. Here's some examples of that. io.file.create text, and here we're going to eventually create a file and add text to a file named employee.txt, and that will be created in the current working directory. Right now, you can assume that the current working directory is the same file as where your exe file will be whenever you execute your program. Here's another example where we would be opening a file in the chapter 9 folder called report.txt, and we'll be adding text to the end of that. There's a couple write commands that we can use. So these will actually open our file, the create text and append text. In a lot of other operating systems, a lot of other programming languages, there's like an open command, but in Visual Basic, the two commands that they have is create text and append text. So whenever I say open a file, really what I'm referring to is using one of these two commands. There's a couple different ways we can write data to a file. You would specify the name of the variable, which in our case would be outfile.write with a uppercase W, and then the data you want to output. And generally, that's going to be a string. It'll be a string value. It could be a single character, or it could be a lot of characters. If you want to end the line of data after you write if you want to, whenever you're, okay, let me try to say that a slightly different way. For the write line command, what it does is it writes the data and then it will end the line and it will go down to the next line in your file. So here's an example showing that, and it kind of displays that or explains that pretty good. We have outfile.write, and we're going to write out the text hello, and we're just going to, at the end of the O in hello, that's where our next letter, whenever we do our next write, will be written to. It's right after the O. If you want to end your line, you want to end that line of text, you could use write line, and then what it does is it moves your cursor or your insertion point, depending on what you want to call it, down on the next line. Then since we've opened our file with a create text or append text, we have to close our file, and the way to do that, and it's really easy, is just say the name of the variable for a file dot close, and that will close the file. So you can read a little bit about that down below here if you want. That pretty much explains it slightly different than how I've explained it. We're going to, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about a example here that deals with creating a game show application. And really all it's going to do is, we're not really going to play a game. All it's going to do is we're going to be able to add contestants to our game. And then later on, we would be able to read contestants that we've already written before. So we're not really going to be playing a game. It's really just keeps track of the users that we're going to be playing the game. So this is what the interface will look like. And one thing that you could do is actually create this application yourself. You could go here to the game show solution in at this path and open it up, and then you'd be able to type in the following lines of text down below here. So the first thing that we've got to do is create our variable that we're going to use. You don't necessarily have to use write or outfile. You could use another variable if you want, but outfile is perfectly fine. So you would write this down, and then the next line is we're going to assume that we're going to be appending onto the end of the file. And if the file doesn't exist, I believe the append text will automatically create that file. That seems to be the normal behavior in most programming languages. And so I believe that's also true here in Visual Basic. So you would say outfile is equal to io file dot append text, and then we're going to have the name of our file, which is contestants.txt. Then we're going to want to take the data that's in our text name field up above, and we're going to want to grab the text out of that field, the string, and then we're going to run the trim function on it to remove any spaces at the beginning or at the end. And so this is going to return a string. This function is here, and we will write it to the out to this file. And we will then, since it says write line, we will terminate that line in our file and move down to the next line. So let's look at what the output would be. We would have our button right click. Here we're declaring our stream writer or our file variable. Then here we're opening the file to append. We're writing the data, and then we're going to close. and then we'll set the contestant text equal to the empty string. So that way the user doesn't have to go back and delete or backspace over the old character that they just inserted. It'll clear that out for them, and we'll get it ready for the next entry. So then go ahead and compile that, maybe add some users as they've got here, maybe add yourself and maybe some of your friends to it as well. If you want, once you do that, you can look for the contestants file. You can look at that in Visual Basic or the Visual Studio, and then open that file and see that you've got a list of users there. Okay, we've talked about how to write files. Now let's talk about how to read data from a file. It's very similar to what we just talked about with the stream writer. Instead, it's called stream reader. And we have our variable. Some examples would be in file as IO stream reader. Here's another example saying that it's a private file. And one of the things that we want to do is before we read a file, we got to make sure that the file exists. If the file doesn't exist, we can't read from it. So there's this IO file exists, and we pass it a file name, and that will check to see if the file exists in the current working directory. So here's an example. IO file exists. We're going to look to see if the employee file, if it exists. If it does, this statement here will return true. If the file does not exist, it will return false. Notice that we're here in an if statement. If it does return true, then we can try to open our text file. And the way we do that was with the IO file, open text, specify the file name, which in this case would be employee.txt. You see that here. To read the line, we can do certain things. There's a peek command which checks to see if we've reached the end of the file, and we'll look at an example of that in just a minute. The two main functions that you'll be using quite a bit are the read line and read to end. The read line will read the next line in the file. Read to end will read all of the contents of the file, and will return that data. So let's look at an example. Let's say that we want to read a text one line at a time and then perform some operation on it. So we could create a variable called string line of text as string, and then we can write a do loop that says do until infile.peak is equal to -1. What this is really saying is do this until we reach the end of the file. So infile.peak, when it equals 1, it means that we've reached the end of the file. If it's in anything but a -1, we haven't reached the end of file. So we then want to read in the next line of data into the string line of text, and then we'll do something with it. In our application that we were working on a minute ago with the game show, what we would do there is put that into our list, and we'll show that here in just a minute. And if you've got, let's say, for example, you just want to display all the contents of a file to a certain place on in your application, you could do it as it's shown here with like a text report field dot text is equal to read to end, and it'll take that data and we'll display it to the screen. And then the close is exactly the same as what we had with the stream writer. It's just the name of the variable dot close. And so moving on to our application, we need to create our file variable, and we say that dim in file as IO stream reader. Then we need to check to see if our contestant file exists, and we do that to see by using an if statement. If IO file exists, the name of the file. If this is true, then we will perform some kind of a task here. else will display some kind of an error saying that we couldn't find the file. And so that would display to the screen if the file does not exist. So here we can open our text. If we once we do this in the if statement, we would put the following lines of code. If the file exists, we then want to open our text file, and we do it this way: IO file, open text, and the name of the file, and that will set our file variable to point to that file. We then want to, in this case, read all of the contents of that file and put it in text contestants. So you see here, and then as shown down here, we would then close that file. So here's your read click procedure. Briefly going over this again, we declare a variable, our file variable. We then check to see if the file exists. If it does, we open the file. We read the contents of the file and put it in text contents, and then we close our file. If the file does not exist, we then print this message. So a little exercise that you could do is actually code this in your application and see if it works. The read line method, we could actually read this one line at a time. The way we would do that is, let's say we wanted to create a list. So at the top here, when we're reading our file, one of the first things we would do is clear the previous names that were there. And we would write this statement here to do that. If there was no contestants in the list contestants component, then it just clears nothing. It just, there's nothing to clear. And then down here, everything's roughly the same except for this loop here. And what this loop will do here is it will read until the end of the file. And then for each line that it reads, it will put that item into the list contestants component. And once we're done with that, then we close the file. So if you worked on the last application, modify your code to do this. It should be an easy 3 or 4 lines change. Execute your code and see how it performs. You can see here now we have a list here, and you would then be able to click on one of these if you wanted to. That would allow you to be able to maybe choose a couple of contestants to play your game. Okay, so that's about it for this lecture. Remember that you've got to declare your variable first to read or write from the file. Then you got to open the file, and you do that a couple different ways. If you're going to write to the file, you use a create text or append text command to open the file, and then you use your write line to write to the file, and then you use the close command to close. For the reader, you have your stream reader, you have your open text that your open text function that opens the file. You then have your read line, I think is what it's called. Let me go back, make sure I'm saying that right. Read line, and then the other one was read to the end, and then you also have your close. So the best way to learn this stuff is to actually go through and apply these concepts. And so do the example that we just showed before, and then go through the apply the concepts lesson to learn how to open a file, how to read it, how to write to a file, and so on. So see you next time.